Welcome, dear listeners, to a place where betrayal is exposed, secrets unravel, and revenge always finds its moment. If you enjoy powerful, emotionally charged stories with unforgettable twists, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with others who love captivating storytelling. And before we begin, I'd truly love to know, where are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments section. The first thing I noticed was my wife's signature on a document she had absolutely no right to touch. I was still holding my car keys when I walked into the title office on Bremer Street and stopped dead. Vanessa was standing at the far end of the conference table in a pale blue blazer I had never seen before, leaning over a thick stack of papers like she owned the room. Beside her stood a broad-shouldered man in a gray suit, his hand resting low on her back in that easy, familiar way that only made sense if they had been touching each other for a long time. My stomach dropped like I had missed the last step on a staircase. The closing officer looked up at me with polite confusion. Vanessa turned around, and for one unguarded second, her whole face went blank. No smile, no explanation, just pure, naked panic flashing across her eyes before she pulled herself back together. Then she said, too brightly, too quickly, "You weren't supposed to be here until later." Not supposed to be here. Like I was the interruption. Like this was something scheduled. Like I wasn't standing there staring at my wife and a stranger in the middle of an attempted sale of property I had built entirely on my own. My eyes dropped to the deed summary on top of the file. Sole title, Marcus Ose. That was the moment I understood. Vanessa had not stolen my life yet. She had only walked herself into a trap she didn't know existed. My name is Marcus Ose. I am 39 years old, originally from Ghana, raised in Columbus, Ohio, and I have spent most of my adult life building things quietly while other people talked loudly about their plans. I work in commercial property compliance for a healthcare real estate group. My days are made of lease reviews, vendor contracts, facility audits, and the kind of fine print that most people skip right past until the wrong detail costs them everything. It is not a flashy job, but it made me careful. And careful people notice things. The properties were not a luxury empire. They were 4 modest but solid assets: a duplex in Westerville, 2 single-family rentals in Reynoldsburg, a small multi-unit building in Gehenna that I bought the year after my mother passed, using money I had saved while working 2 jobs through my late 20s. I bought each one slowly, one sacrifice at a time, with no safety net and no cosigner. Vanessa loved telling people we were growing our investment portfolio together. What she actually meant was that she enjoyed standing in rooms my labor paid for and calling them ours. Standing in that title office, watching her pretend authority over things I had bled to build. I felt something shift inside me. The heartbreak was still there, but underneath it, something colder and stronger was already forming. The man beside Vanessa introduced himself as Preston Cole. He did it the way men do when they think the deal is already done. Calm smile, firm handshake extended in my direction. He called himself a transition and asset advisory consultant. I looked at his hand and left it hanging in the air. Transition advisory. That was one way to describe sleeping with a married woman while helping her cash out properties she didn't legally own. Vanessa jumped in immediately, talking fast, filling the silence before I could. She said there had been a miscommunication. She said she had been trying to handle things to reduce my stress. She said I had been so buried in work lately that she was just trying to move things forward for both of us. For us. Like this was a kindness. Like betrayal wears a different name when someone calls it helpful. I let her talk. That was what rattled her more than anything else. Vanessa had always been better in conflict than in silence. She could spin anger, redirect tears, reframe accusations. But stillness gave her nothing to work with. My quiet unsettled her, in a way my shouting never would have. When she finally stopped, I turned to the closing officer and asked one simple question. Who authorized this sale when the title is solely in my name? Nobody answered. That silence told me more than any confession ever could. I walked out before Vanessa could drag me into a public confrontation. The cold February air hit my face hard as I pushed through the glass door. I sat in my car with both hands wrapped around the steering wheel, staring at the lit windows of the title office, while people moved around inside like nothing extraordinary had just happened. Somewhere in there, my wife was scrambling for a new version of events. Somewhere in there, the man whose hand had been on her back was probably wondering what she had promised him and whether those promises were still good. I could have gone back inside. I could have made a scene loud enough to shake the walls. But anger is expensive, and people like Vanessa are counting on you to spend yours recklessly. So instead, I opened the Notes app on my phone and wrote down everything. The time, the address, the closing officer's name, Preston Cole's name, the property address listed on the file, every single word I had heard. I emailed myself a time-stamped summary before I even started the engine. My hands were shaking when I hit send. But the moment I did, something shifted. The chaos inside me started organizing itself into something I could actually use. Panic is useless, but panic turned into documentation becomes a different thing entirely. It becomes evidence. I left work early the next day and drove straight to the office of my property attorney, a man named Clifford Boateng, who had structured my holding documents 5 years earlier. His assistant remembered me without prompting. Within 90 minutes, I was across a desk from him, watching him review my title records with the careful attention of someone who already smelled smoke before anyone said fire. He didn't take long. "Your wife is not listed on any of these titles," he said simply. "She has no legal authority to market, negotiate, or execute a sale on your behalf." I asked whether marriage changed that calculation in any way. He folded his hands together. "Marriage can create complications during divorce proceedings. It does not transfer deeded ownership automatically." I felt my lungs open properly for the first time in almost 48 hours. Then he added, quietly, "However, if she misrepresented her authority to licensed professionals to advance a transaction, that moves well beyond a domestic issue." There it was. Not just betrayal. Exposure. Vanessa hadn't just cheated on me and made plans to leave. She had built a scheme around a legal fiction and pulled licensed professionals into it, betting that confidence and charm could substitute for actual ownership. I left his office carrying copies of everything and one clean, cold thought circling in my head. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had built her escape plan on a foundation that was never hers to stand on. That evening, I went home before Vanessa returned and walked through the house with completely new eyes. The framed artwork above the fireplace, bought the month I closed on the Westerville duplex. The leather sectional in the living room, financed with rental income from Reynoldsburg while I was eating packed lunches and skipping vacations. The professional-grade kitchen appliances she showed off at dinner parties. Purchased the same month, I stayed in a budget hotel for a week to oversee a full unit renovation myself because I couldn't afford to pay a crew the full rate. Vanessa had not built this life alongside me. She had decorated herself inside it and called the decoration partnership. That understanding hurt differently than the affair. The cheating was a wound. But the theft of the story, watching her take my discipline and exhaustion and private wins and retell them as shared achievement, that was something I hadn't found a name for yet. When she walked in at 8:45, coat still on, expression carefully neutral, she found me at the kitchen island with a glass of water and a legal pad. "You're overreacting," she said before she even put her bag down. I almost smiled. I looked at her and asked, very evenly, "How many properties did you try to list?" Her hand slipped on the back of the kitchen chair. That small slip was enough to confirm I already knew the answer. The next morning I went to work in a dark green sweater and dress shoes and approved a fire suppression maintenance quote, like my marriage wasn't quietly collapsing behind me. There is something genuinely strange about betrayal happening beside ordinary life. My assistant asked whether the vendor call for Thursday needed to move. A building engineer left a voicemail about a cooling system concern. Someone from legal emailed about a lease renewal clause. The ordinary rhythm of the workday kept moving, and somehow that steadiness saved me. It gave my face somewhere to be. Nobody in that office knew that the man reviewing parking structure bids at 10 in the morning had barely slept and had spent the previous evening documenting his wife's scheme in a locked folder on his personal laptop. But at lunch, I pulled up the county auditor's online portal and started checking property records. What I found made my chest tighten. One property had been informally marketed, 2 had preliminary listing packets generated, and the Gahana multi-unit building, my cleanest, highest value asset, was already sitting under a contingent sale agreement, pending final authority verification that Vanessa had apparently told the broker was forthcoming. This was not one impulsive decision made in a moment of weakness. This was a pipeline, which meant I was not dealing with a messy emotional mistake. I was dealing with a fully constructed exit strategy. I called my college friend Adeyeze Nwosu that evening. She had spent 12 years in mortgage processing and title support and was exactly the kind of person who knew how real estate fraud actually unfolds in practice. I didn't ask her for anything improper. I just described what I had seen and asked what the typical exposure looked like when someone marketed property without legal authority. Her pause before answering was longer than it should have been. Then she said, "Marcus, were there wire transfer instructions in the closing packet?" "Yes, they had been." Another pause. Then, quietly, "Someone was expecting funds to move very soon." I leaned back in my home office chair and stared at the ceiling. Vanessa hadn't just imagined leaving. She had started arranging the actual money flows, real ones, immediate ones. Enough to explain why Preston Cole had been standing in that closing room with the easy posture of a man who had already mentally spent money he was waiting to receive. Before she hung up, Adeyeze said one thing that stayed with me through the rest of that night. People get reckless when they've emotionally already spent money they haven't received yet. That one sentence reframed everything. Vanessa wasn't calm because she was innocent. She was calm because she had already started living inside the future she planned to buy with my assets. While Vanessa showered that night, I sat in the guest room and went through months of shared emails with the eyes of someone reading evidence rather than correspondence. The language shift was unmistakable once I knew to look for it. About 5 months earlier, Vanessa stopped using phrases like "someday we should think about the portfolio" and started asking pointed questions. What were the current payoff balances on the Reynoldsburg properties? What was the tax escrow status on the Gahana building? When did the current tenant leases expire? At the time, I had read it as genuine interest. I had even felt touched that she was engaging. Now every question looked exactly like what it was. Research. Then I found the email that made my blood go cold. She had forwarded a deed summary from our shared home printer folder to an address I didn't recognize. The address resolved back to Preston Cole. I sat in the dim guest room and stared at that line until the words blurred. The affair and the property scheme hadn't been running separately. They had been feeding each other. She had used my trust in our relationship as cover for gathering the information she needed to move against me. Once I understood that, I stopped waiting for her to tell me the truth on her own. I started building the case without her. I met with Clifford again 2 days later, this time bringing full financial records. That was when I discovered a transfer pattern I had completely missed. Small, steady withdrawals from our joint household account into a separate personal account Vanessa had quietly opened on her own. Not large enough to set off any alarms month to month. Just consistent, disciplined, cumulative. I sat across from my attorney and traced the rows with my finger while my jaw stayed tight. It wasn't the total amount that hit hardest, it was the patience of it. People imagine betrayal as something wild and sudden. What they don't account for is the kind that arrives in careful, measured increments over months, calibrated precisely so the person who trusts you never sees the pattern forming. Clifford asked whether I was ready to confront her directly. I said no, not yet, because Vanessa still believed I was wounded, but disorganized. That belief was her biggest vulnerability. The longer she kept thinking I was too hurt to think clearly, the more space she gave me to see the full picture. That night I came home, heated leftovers, asked whether she wanted hot sauce, and watched her say yes with the same mouth that had been quietly planning to disappear. I smiled back across the kitchen counter and felt something in my chest go completely still. I looked into Preston Cole more carefully the following week. He wasn't some random person Vanessa had stumbled into an affair with. He had a professional history that made the whole picture darker. A trail of short-lived ventures, distressed asset consulting, accelerated liquidation advisory, vague investment facilitation roles that never seemed to last longer than a year or two in any one place. Not exactly a criminal record. More like a man who had spent years hovering near other people's money and calling the hovering a career. One regional business column from 3 years back quoted him on a panel about rapid portfolio repositioning for reluctant asset holders. Reluctant asset holders. I was the reluctant asset holder in this story. The phrase made my stomach turn. It also explained where Vanessa had picked up the new language she'd been using lately. Portfolio liquidity, unlocking trapped equity, strategic asset transition. Those were not phrases she had developed on her own. Those were Preston Cole's fingerprints pressed into her vocabulary. The more I learned about him, the less I feared him personally, and the more clearly I understood the financial danger he represented. Affairs run on emotion. Money schemes run on pressure and timing. If he had convinced Vanessa she was entitled to assets she didn't own, he was eventually going to push her into a mistake big enough to expose them both. I just needed to make sure I was fully prepared when that happened. 4 days later, the closing officer from the Bremer Street title office called me directly. Her name was Olamide Ferris, and she spoke with the careful, controlled tone of someone trying to stay professional while privately managing alarm. She said she was calling to request written confirmation regarding ownership authority on the property file in question. I confirmed in writing, by email, copied to Clifford, that title on all 4 properties remained solely in my name. Then she asked, precisely and without softening, whether I had issued written power of attorney, any form of sale authorization, or agency representation to my wife for any of these assets. No, I said. None. The silence on her end lasted just long enough to mean something. She said the open file would be frozen pending legal review. Frozen. I stood at my office window and let that word settle over me. Vanessa's entire escape plan had just hit a concrete wall. The closing was dead. The contingent contract had no legal foundation. The wire instructions were attached to nothing. And the best part, she had no idea I was the one who had quietly placed that wall directly in her path. She would find out soon. But not from me. From the process she had set in motion. When Vanessa realized the Gehenna sale had stalled, she came at me with tears. Not messy, real ones. These were precise. The kind that form without falling. The kind a person produces when they want sympathy without actually losing composure. She caught me in the kitchen after dinner, holding a glass of wine, voice pitched low and trembling in all the right places. She said I had become emotionally unavailable. She said my constant focus on work had made her feel invisible inside our own home. She said she had only been looking for options because she felt so alone. She said this, all of this, was my fault for being too cold, too controlled, too absent. I let her finish. I let her build the version of events where my steadiness gave her the right to steal from me. Then I said, very quietly, did my emotional unavailability also explain forging authority over property that was never in your name? The wine glass wobbled in her hand. Just slightly. But I saw it. She shifted from sadness to anger, the way people do when sympathy stops working as a tool. She accused me of hoarding control, of treating her like a tenant in her own home, of making everything a transaction, and there it was. Not guilt, not remorse. Resentment. Vanessa didn't believe she had done something wrong. She believed I had been selfishly withholding what she deserved. That belief made her dangerous. And it was exactly what was going to bring her down. I worked with Clifford over the following days to tighten every structure quietly. Property management communications were rerouted through a single verified contact. Title alert notifications were added on all 4 assets. Entity documents were reviewed and updated. Banking authorizations were clarified and restricted. None of it was dramatic, no confrontations, no raised voices, just clean, lawful, airtight controls. Exactly the kind of protections responsible people install when they finally accept that love has been leaving a security gap wide open. Every step felt like another lock sliding into place. My grief changed texture during those days. The hot, humiliating kind that makes everything feel unstable slowly gave way to something cooler and more functional, almost clinical. I was no longer trying to understand why Vanessa had done this. That question had an answer I already knew, and it wasn't going to help me. I was focused now on limiting how much damage she could still cause. That first night, I slept in the guest room with the door locked. I expected to feel bitter or hollow. Instead, I felt safe. There is something shockingly clarifying about the moment you realize you are no longer building a life with someone. You are protecting yourself from them. Once that shift happens, tenderness stops confusing your judgment. And I needed sharp judgment for what I found out the following morning. Vanessa had approached a second broker entirely. The second broker was not a large company. It was a boutique local office run by a woman named Felicity Crane, who had known Vanessa through a local women's networking group they both attended. That detail landed differently than the rest, because it meant Vanessa had been cultivating this socially too. Smiling at events, building relationships, sharing selective versions of our financial picture with people who had no reason to question them. Painting herself as someone effectively managing our real estate, possibly suggesting we were restructuring jointly, possibly implying I was the difficult, reluctant partner holding everything back. Whatever version she had given, it had been convincing enough for professionals to proceed without asking for the documentation they should have required from the start. I met with Felicity, with Clifford present. She arrived professionally composed and left visibly pale. Once she saw the actual title records, the entity documents, the absence of any authorization, and the timeline of what she had been told versus what was true, her entire posture shifted from social confidence to legal self-protection. She said she had relied entirely on Vanessa's representations. Maybe so, but good faith has its limits when the paperwork doesn't exist. Before we left, Felicity asked quietly, "Did your wife know she wasn't on the title?" I looked directly at her. She absolutely knew. From Felicity's expression, I understood that answer landed badly for everyone who had ever let Vanessa act important around assets she didn't own. I thought I was ahead of the damage until one of my Reynoldsburg tenants called me directly. Her name was Brenda Okoro. She had rented from me for 3 years, always paid early, always communicated clearly. She sounded uncomfortable on the phone, like someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. She told me that a woman and a man had visited the property the previous week, claiming to be conducting a transition assessment. The man had asked her about her lease end date, whether she had flexibility on her move-out timeline, and whether she had experienced any maintenance delays she wanted noted before the new structure came into place. I pressed my palm flat on my desk to keep my voice steady. They had walked through occupied units, not as viewers, as owners in waiting, already calculating tenant timelines, vacancy windows, projected cash flow, like they were counting furniture in a house they had already mentally moved into. That moment changed something in me. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't about my pride or my financial security or the humiliation of a cheating spouse. This was about real people whose homes and stability were being casually treated as pieces of someone else's exit plan. I sent formal written notices to all tenants that same afternoon, clarifying sole ownership and instructing them to disregard any unauthorized communication regarding the properties. Then I sat in the restroom at work, pressed my knuckles against my mouth, and stayed very still until the disgust settled enough for me to function again. I knew it was time to speak with a divorce attorney. I found Corinne Asante through a referral from Clifford. She was sharp, methodical, and completely immune to emotional performance, which I appreciated more than I could say at that point. I met her on a Wednesday afternoon between a vendor renewal meeting and a fire inspection walkthrough. The combination of those things, legal dissolution and building safety compliance, felt fitting in a way I couldn't fully explain. Corinne listened to the entire situation without interrupting once. Then she asked very direct questions about the title structure, shared account history, whether we had a prenuptial agreement, how long the joint account withdrawals had been occurring, and whether I wanted to pursue immediate residential separation. By the time I left her office, I had a clear plan. not vengeance, a roadmap. That distinction mattered. Vanessa thrived in chaos. She was built for emotional fog, for situations messy enough that people just settle to make the noise stop. Corinne's plan gave me sequence, structure, and specific steps. Filing order, asset documentation approach, residence strategy. Walking to my car in the cold evening air, I realized something that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't afraid of losing the marriage anymore. I was quietly relieved that there was a way through it. And that relief told me everything I needed to know about how long it had actually been over. Right when I thought I had seen the worst of it, another layer appeared. A woman I barely knew, a neighbor named Paulette who occasionally waved from across the street, stopped me near the mailbox on a Saturday morning. She looked uncomfortable, like she had been debating whether to say anything for a while. She told me she didn't want to interfere, but she felt I should know that Vanessa had been introducing Preston publicly for several weeks. At a neighborhood gathering she hadn't mentioned to me. At a local restaurant at least twice. Not as a colleague, not as a consultant, as someone who was clearly part of her plans going forward. I thanked Paulette, went back inside, and sat at the kitchen table without moving for several minutes. Weeks. While I had been managing lease renewals and facility budgets and telling myself the distance in our marriage was just stress and overwork, my wife had been openly rehearsing her next life with other people watching. That should have destroyed me. Instead, it did something I hadn't expected. It removed the last remaining piece of ambiguity I had been quietly protecting. There was no misunderstood tension to untangle here. No rough patch that patience might have repaired. There was only a woman who had decided to leave and had spent months extracting what she could before going. Once I accepted that fully, I became very difficult to manipulate. The real shift in power began when Preston started getting nervous. He wasn't loyal to Vanessa. He was loyal to the outcome she had promised him. The moment title issues became real, that loyalty began to thin quickly. Clifford received a careful, indirect inquiry from an attorney connected to Preston, seeking clarification on whether certain sale agreements he had been involved in facilitating were potentially binding or subject to reversal. That one inquiry told me everything. Preston was trying to quietly create distance between himself and the scheme, without admitting how deep he had been in it. Which meant one of two things. Either Vanessa had lied to him about the state of the titles, or he had believed her until licensed professionals started using words like unauthorized representation and fraudulent authority. I suspected it was both. Men like Preston often consider themselves too experienced to be deceived, right up until the paperwork proves otherwise. The following evening, Vanessa came home with a look I hadn't seen on her before. Not composed, not calculating, genuinely rattled. She walked into the kitchen and demanded, "What did you do?" I was reviewing a maintenance schedule at the counter. I told the truth, I said. That answer infuriated her more than any accusation would have, because truth has no good counter. It doesn't feel like a fight. It doesn't give the other person anything to push against. It just sits there, solid, and lets everything built on lies fall apart around it. I thought the title issue would be the final collapse point. It wasn't. Corinne's team, while reviewing our joint finances thoroughly, found something I hadn't uncovered on my own. Vanessa's separate account wasn't only holding the household withdrawals I had already identified, it was also carrying a short-term personal loan and 2 credit cards I had never seen or been told about. The charges mapped a very specific picture. Boutique hotel stays, flight holds, interior design consultation fees, moving company quotes. All of them timed to align with projected closing windows on the property sales. My wife had not just planned to leave, she had borrowed money against the fantasy of leaving, spending ahead of funds she expected my assets to generate. That detail changed something in how I understood the whole situation. Until that moment, I had allowed myself to wonder, in the quiet corner of my mind that grief always seems to hold open, whether some part of this had been about love. Whether she had genuinely fallen for Preston and done desperate, wrong things trying to escape a marriage she no longer wanted. Debt answered that question without sentiment. Debt shows appetite. It shows a person who is not running toward something emotional. She was running toward an upgraded life. Preston wasn't the point. He was the vehicle. My heartbreak didn't disappear after that, but it got smaller, contained inside a much larger truth. I had married someone whose hunger had finally grown bigger than her patience for hiding it. Vanessa worked in transaction coordination for a mid-sized commercial brokerage downtown. Not a senior role, but close enough to deals and professional networks that she had always enjoyed sounding more significant than her actual position. She liked borrowing the language of the industry and wearing it as expertise. That proximity had given her both the confidence and the contacts to attempt what she had attempted. Once the unauthorized listing issue began circulating quietly among local title professionals and brokerage contacts, it didn't erupt publicly. It did something worse. It followed her professionally in small, precise ways. Responses slowed. Certain contacts stopped being available. One transaction coordinator began copying extra people on routine file correspondence. A listing agent she had worked with for years declined to take her call twice in the same week. Nobody said anything directly, at least not that I heard about firsthand. But professional credibility doesn't need an announcement. It just quietly withdraws. I heard about it through Felicity's office. Apparently, people had started asking whether Vanessa was the same person connected to the Collins title dispute. The same Vanessa. I read that update standing in the supply corridor at work, the fluorescent light humming overhead. And I felt no satisfaction. Not triumph, not pleasure at her pain, just a quiet, almost tired sense of inevitability. Because once the truth enters professional rooms, it doesn't need drama to do its work. It just sits down and waits. The settlement meeting happened in Corinne's conference room on a gray Tuesday morning. Vanessa arrived in a camel coat, expression carefully composed, lips pressed into the particular line women wear when they're trying to project dignity while something large is falling apart around them. Preston did not come. That detail, his absence, told me more than any speech from him could have. She presented her terms: amicable dissolution. She would stop contesting the title question. She would vacate the house without a formal dispute. She wanted a lump sum settlement and a clean release from scrutiny regarding the prior financial transfers and the property marketing attempts. In plain language, let her keep what she had taken, pay her to go, and agree not to make the record any uglier than it already was. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and listened without responding. Then Corinne placed the compiled documentation in front of her. The full timeline, the unauthorized listing efforts, the tenant interference, the joint account withdrawals, the private account balances, the undisclosed credit lines, the wire instructions in the original closing packet. Preston's involvement, documented through communications and professional inquiry. I watched Vanessa turn the pages. Her expression didn't collapse dramatically. It drained, slowly and completely. The face of someone realizing the person they believed was too trusting to notice had instead been quietly watching and recording everything. I declined her offer, not with cruelty, with completeness, because accepting her terms would have allowed her to keep the story where she almost won. She didn't. Corinne filed the divorce petition on a Monday. By Wednesday, the contingent sale on the Gahana building was formally dead. By Friday, title watches had been confirmed across all 4 properties. Brokerage contacts had quietly distanced themselves from Vanessa, and Preston had apparently removed every professional trace of her from the circles where they had been appearing together. No confrontation, no dramatic exit. He simply evaporated the way people do when the money they came for disappears. Vanessa moved out the following weekend. Not into a stylish new apartment with city views and a fresh start built on my equity. Into a short-term furnished rental arranged in a hurry, carrying undisclosed debt, mounting legal fees, and a professional reputation that now caused people to ask for written verification on things she used to handle with a phone call. The emotional return came to me in layers over the days that followed. First, the silence of the house after her things were gone. Then the first full night of sleep I had managed in months. Then the morning I made coffee in my own kitchen and didn't have to wonder whether the person in the next room was lying to me. People think winning looks like confrontation, like a moment where justice announces itself loudly and the wrongdoer finally faces the room. Sometimes winning looks like ordinary stillness, returning so completely it almost makes you dizzy. And that stillness was only the beginning. 3 months later, I walked the Westerville duplex alone in the late afternoon. The brick glowed warm in the fading winter light. A tenant on the second floor waved from the window. The side yard needed attention before spring. The gutters over the back unit would need replacing before summer rains arrived. Normal problems, real maintenance, actual responsibility with my name genuinely attached to it. Mine. I refinanced 2 of the properties under improved terms, merged a redundant service contract into a better vendor arrangement, mapped out renovations I had delayed for 2 years because Vanessa always wanted cash directed somewhere more visible and immediately gratifying. I brought in a stronger property manager, updated reserves, cleaned the entity structure until it felt not just protected but genuinely organized. Nobody talks enough about the rebuilding part. Surviving is not the finish line. Rebuilding clearly and deliberately is. At work, my supervisor offered me an expanded regional oversight role. He mentioned during the conversation that my performance over the previous quarter had shown unusual focus and composure under sustained pressure. I nodded and thanked him. If he had known what the pressure actually was, he might have used different words. My life did not become dramatic or glamorous after Vanessa left. It became mine again, and after living quietly with ongoing theft, genuine ownership feels almost like something sacred. In the end, Vanessa lost exactly what arrogance always costs a person. Not only the money she had planned to take, not only the lover who disappeared the moment the promised funds evaporated, not only the professional image she had spent years constructing in small rooms where people admired her adjacency to real estate deals. She lost the central fantasy that had made all of it feel justified. The fantasy that proximity to hard work is the same thing as doing it. The belief that being married to someone who builds quietly means you own what they build. The comfortable assumption that the steadier, less dramatic person in the room is too distracted or too trusting to notice what is happening right beside them. And me, I kept the titles. I kept the properties. I kept the life I had built before she arrived and the stronger, cleaner one I constructed after she left. I painted the guest room a deep blue gray. I replaced the sofa she had picked out. I stopped second-guessing my own instincts about people. I stopped confusing patience with weakness or caution with paranoia. I stopped performing contentment inside a home that had stopped feeling safe. The people who betray quiet, careful builders always make the same mistake. They look at steadiness and see someone too slow to respond. They look at silence and hear agreement. They look at a person who built something real alone over many years of sacrifice and assume that person doesn't understand what they have. They are always wrong. Sometimes the person they underestimate doesn't break. Sometimes she sharpens. Sometimes she documents. Sometimes she walks out of the whole disaster, holding every deed that mattered from the very beginning. That was my real answer to everything Vanessa tried to take. Not revenge. Just the life I had already built, fully intact, with her name nowhere on it.